Today, we're talking about a new development in the practice of diversity, inclusion, and equity among businesses. And this is something that can best be summed up as a backlash. What we've been seeing in the past 2 to 3 months is a number of high-profile global corporations announcing that they are planning to change their emphasis with a focus that can perhaps best be summed up as ROI, so return on investment, rather than DEI. And we're delighted to welcome Farrah Qureshi to bring her insights to today's discussion. Farrah, you are founder and CEO of the Global Diversity Practice, and you have 30 plus years of experience in advising world leaders, businesses, brands, and governments in how to create more diverse, more inclusive, more equitable cultures. And I'm guessing that you're no stranger to pushback. So in terms of the work that you're doing, it would be great to get your perspective today in the organizations that you're advising, where you're providing consultancy, research, culture change. How are you seeing this backlash manifesting? And is it something that worries you?
So delighted to be here today to talk about a very topical and very important conversation and dialogue that relates to the current backlash against corporate DEI initiatives. Obviously, lots of different opinions being voiced, expressed, and I guess from my perspective, it's welcome. I'm glad we're having this conversation. Any conversation, any transformation, any culture change process should be discussed. It should be debated. The dialogue should be continuous. That's what diversity and inclusion is all about. We open ourselves to multiple perspectives. Some of those we might not agree with, but at least we provide space and agency to have those conversations and to consider the impact and the key messages that are coming through. So I'm really pleased to have an opportunity to share my thoughts and views about this important topic.
And Farrah, thank you for being here. Are you seeing this backlash as something that's happening primarily in the media, with lots of high-profile people making statements and accusations of wokery? Or is this something that you're actually starting to see within the many companies that you're advising around the world?
So definitely in the media, obviously, huge controversies, language like D&I must die, quite powerful expositions of people's opinions and thoughts. And the fact that we're discussing it also tells me that it's having an impact, because DE&I or inclusion, or whichever way you decide to position the narrative, is designed to do just that. It's challenging the status quo. The status quo doesn't serve all, it serves some. And it's continued to do that historically, from an economic perspective, from a societal perspective, for centuries. But here is a moment, a defining moment, a social tipping point, where that conversation is either causing threat because some perceive it as a zero-sum game, or it's producing fear in terms of particularly the way privileges are going to be distributed or thought about, and also the voice of those individuals or those groups and communities, societies across the world that haven't had fair opportunity and access. Their voices are getting louder, whether it's a consumer, whether, who are voting with their spending power, voting with their challenging and their boycott culture. They're voting through social media and calling companies out when they see behavior, either through brands or the way that communications are conveyed or products or what senior leaders are saying. So I absolutely do see this as a critical moment for us to refresh, recalibrate, and relook at the conversation. But I'm glad we're having this debate. And going back to your point around, am I seeing it more in the media and less in the corporate world? Well, there are movements in the corporate world, without a doubt. We've seen in the last year diversity roles disappearing. We're seeing less postings. We're seeing departments being cut, particularly in some sectors more than others. But actually, I'm sure the reason and the rationale, it may be twofold. It may be that the organisations are doing it for themselves now, which is exactly what we promote in diversity and inclusion. We want companies to make us redundant. We want them to do it for themselves. We want every senior leader to be thinking about D&I on a daily basis, every individual contributor, team member thinking about what they can do. And it shouldn't be solely the role of the D&I leads in organizations. It's a point in time in D&I. Yes, you might need that front-loaded support, that expertise, that specialism, and your different stages of your D&I journey. But there comes a moment when companies, organizations, on the leadership agenda, is part of the values and mission and commercial objectives of the company. It's part of competencies. It's part of your everyday. So that might be the reason. Let's not look at it all in a negative way. If the reason is because it's a response to wokeness, these conversations, then that's another matter altogether. And what I would say is this is a moment in time where you differentiate those that were being performative, those that were being checklist and tick box, those companies that weren't being authentic about this issue. Then they may decide to take a different route. However, resilience and authenticity is what will differentiate those that will win the war for inclusion and those that lose it.
So I like the idea that there could be a really positive perspective here, which means that actually DEI is becoming so much the fabric of organizations that it's just becoming part of the everyday. So you no longer need to identify it. You don't need a separate department. It just becomes part of what everybody wants to do. But there must be another side to this where that sort of very idealistic view is actually countered by the fact that there will be a lot of DEI professionals out there who this year will be talking to their senior leadership teams and outlining programs and seeing a lot of negativity and hearing a lot of negativity and maybe being told no and maybe being asked to curtail programs. So I suppose an interesting conversation would be to get your thoughts on, if you are that DEI person and you're in an organization and you're trying to convince a growingly skeptical leadership base that DEI is still important, that it's still something that they ought to be doing, you ought to be thinking about it, must remain part of that culture. What are some of the things they should be thinking about? What are some of the ways that you win back the confidence of those leaders?
Great question. So my response to that question, well, what I would say is if you are a D&I professional, and I think this is also very contextual and it's also based on geography. So a lot of the conversation that I'm seeing around this topic in terms of backlash actually is, primarily in North America. I'm seeing the backlash. And what I would say to those D&I professionals in those regions is for us to take a moment to look at the approach that we've taken and try to understand where the backlash is coming and what's the rationale, what's the reasoning, what's the primary challenge that we're facing. And actually, have we as D&I professionals, a challenge to ourselves, embedded DE&I as the very fabric of organizational being? And if we have, then it's going to be very hard to dismantle that. But if we haven't, then there's work to do, right? Because if we're getting discredited, even destroyed, then a really important look at the steps we've taken so far, where our focus has been. Have we truly promoted inclusion as the way ahead? Have we truly promoted it as the key GP? Or have we presented it in a way which feeds that perception of a zero-sum game? So I do think, it's an important moment for us all. We have to continually reinvent ourselves. There was a moment when the whole conversation was around, the ethical case, and then it moved into the business case, and then it moved into the future of workplace, and it's evolved, and we have to keep ahead of that. And so keeping ahead of the sectorial trends, the macroeconomic trends, the geopolitical trends, and making sure we continue to demonstrate not only our relevancy, but also how critical DE&I is to any organization we work with, particularly when you focus on talent, brand, innovation, those three areas, and link it to culture and commercial objectives. I think that formula works. And yeah, a moment to recap, to recalibrate. I think that's what I'd say to my DE&I professionals, but not lose our nerve. It's really important for us to stay resilient in this moment. Anybody that works in this space will have always faced what I call occupational hazards: cynicism, denial, apathy, resistance, insidious resistance. These are all part and parcel of the daily reality of anybody in this space. And we have managed those occupational hazards as part and parcel of our toolkit. So here's an opportunity to reinvigorate, to reboost those responses and deal with the current conversation in a contemporary way, and in a way which means that we tackle those challenges head on. Have confidence, in what we're promoting, but understand the other perspective, which we might not even agree with, and try to mitigate the risk of that perspective. Try to influence, try to make sure that I've often put myself in the place of the detractor. I always look at risks when I'm working with my clients. I actually start from that first. I want to listen to the detractors. They might have something that I need to hear. And once I've done that risk assessment, I then build my narrative, I build my business case, and I build my approach and methodology so that we've navigated it, but we haven't discounted it, because there might be something in that challenge that I need to take account of. We can't stay in a bubble in our world of DE&I. We have to adapt, we have to be flexible, and we have to continue to believe in the power of the message, but also the impact of what we're here to do. And it's not easy. It's hard.
So you use the expression zero-sum game. And it made me think that, of course, we're in a time when inflation remains high, cost of living remains high, cost of businesses remains high. Businesses are examining all of their expenditure. Do you think that, to a certain extent, a lot of what we're seeing is actually due to the fact that, to be honest, quite a lot of, or some DEI initiatives actually haven't been as strategic as they could be, haven't been as on point, and that the DEI professionals themselves haven't been as rigorous. That, when you're trying to kind of foment that flame, if you'll do it how you can, and you haven't been as strategic, you haven't really thought about how can this bring value to this business, what is the right thing to do. You've just kind of waved the flags, done your International Women's Day piece, done your Pride, do you know what I mean, done that performative piece without necessarily thinking, how can DEI really help this business to become a better and stronger organization that is achieving its goals?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't put all of the emphasis on the D&I professionals, it's also the way organizations have approached this whole topic. So they've been programmatic, right? They've had a few events, they've, done a few things, they may have set up a couple of employee networks, but it hasn't been strategic. They haven't created an ecosystem which allows, employee voice to be heard, talent to progress, blockages to be, to be plugged. They haven't looked at the whole strategic value add of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so obviously when the headwinds are strong, when the macroeconomic disruption is going on, like you said, the economic factors are meaning that, we're all having to do more with less, resources are squeezed. And the first thing that often goes is learning, consultancy and training. And yet in these moments of time, when you're doing more with less and you're up against so many challenges, actually the capability, the confidence, the agility, the ability of your employees to flex and adjust and manage that process is even more critical. So it's a little bit of a short-term approach to let go of this conversation in a moment when it's needed more than ever. And, we have no doubts about that. Look at the current conversations we're having, the crises that we see across the world. We see frustrated consumers, we see constrained labour markets. There's lots of volatility domestically, politically. We've got advance of AI. There's ongoing shifts in global conversations. For me, inclusion is the glue almost. It's the glue, but it's also an opportunity. There's something solid about investing in the fundamentals and the foundational stuff. And if we haven't done that, when the headwinds come, then everything falls down. So those companies that are being strategic, those D&I professionals that have built D&I into the ecosystem, also those companies that are not just being reactive. So, if you think about some of the movements, Me Too, the tragic murder of George Floyd, for some, that was a moment in time in our profession where we, there was a legitimacy. There was again, look at what's happening in the world, and you as companies have a responsibility. You have a right and a responsibility to do something to wade into this conversation and do something meaningful. But at the same time, if it's been reactive, if it's been programmatic, if it's been checklist, then it's not going to be resilient and it's not going to sustain itself. We have to build D&I into the very fabric, thinking and mindset of our companies, our leaders, and our organizations.
And stop AI. I couldn't agree more. And stop thinking of DEI as something that sits separate and outside from those big macroeconomic conversations, because the truth is, in addition to facing rising costs, rising energy costs, the whole battle towards net zero, how are companies going to decarbonize? How is that going to affect cost? There's big operational questions. There's also the ongoing talent shortage. There's also the productivity issues that so many businesses face. There's also that transition to hybrid working, isn't there? And all of these things, particularly with newer generations coming into the workforce, being very demanding, being very vocal. How would you, when you're talking to CEOs, and I know that, Farrah, one of the things that you do is to mentor CEOs through these journeys and very much into, how can you become that inclusive leader? How can you adapt your language? How would you talk to a CEO now that's approaching his workforce, wanting to show that they're aware of this conversation that's going on, they're aware of the questions that are being asked around DEI, but that they want to continue their commitment because they see that strategic value and that strategic importance?
True leadership is demonstrated in times of challenge. And true leadership is not just our words, it's our actions. It's also true true leadership. This is the moment. This is what will differentiate those that are ambassadors, role models, those that are going to lead ahead, the leaders of the future, and those that have been performative and not authentic around this conversation. So I would be saying let me give you an example. I worked with a leader in oil and gas. When I first met him, CEO, I asked him what was his, and there's something I ask all my CEO clients. What do you want? What impact? What's your mission for the future? What's your vision for your business? What's your vision for your marketplace? What's your vision for growth and sustainability and commercial and, corporate responsibility objectives? So that's where I always start. And in there, I pull out the threads. And, when I'm coaching my CEOs, we pull out the threads that underpin the very principles that inclusion promotes. And then we make the connections. So one of my clients, CEO in oil and gas, said, I want to be the best in this sector. I want to be the best in this region. Other companies look to us and they follow our practices. We contribute up to 60% of the GDP of the country. So I want to be a role model. I want to be a leader. I want to show that we are ahead of the game, and we are brave and we're courageous and we're not frightened of challenging the status quo. And so that's where my first conversation was. And then we had the oil and gas crisis, right? Where it hit literally within 5 or 6 months that happened. And I remember my conversation with him, because there was pressure, not from him, but from others, to let go of the conversation, to do what some companies are doing, which is reduce their budgets, stop halfway through. But what was fascinating was that challenge was brought up again. And my response to him was, this is the moment where the rubber hits the road. So what are you going to do? Think about that future that we envisioned, and think about what happens if we take out this conversation at this moment in time. What is the risk? What are you going to lose? And what are the benefits if you keep on this journey? And he stayed and he delivered, and he delivered on his mission too. And not only that, his organization was able to navigate a very difficult crisis through this approach of, the approach of inclusion.
Now, it's interesting that you mention a CEO in a sector like oil and gas. And I would have thought, Farrah, that in the many years that you have been advising businesses across the world in more than 160 countries, I think, that in all of those years you have come across a certain amount of skepticism. So the skepticism of, a DEI must die. That isn't new to you. I would have thought, when you think about those examples, what is the one that is there one that stands out to you as like, that was the moment when I realized that I could counter any degree of skepticism, and that I embrace skepticism? Was there one CEO that made you realize how useful it is to have a skeptic in the room, how useful it is to have somebody in the room who says, DEI must die. This is a waste of time. This is a waste of money.
Yeah. Just to say, I welcome skepticism, Deborah. In fact, it's what fuels my approach. It's what, and then it's obviously my approach. So skepticism and dealing with that is a daily reality. And what it helps me to do is to think about my narrative, think about how am I going to position this in order to get buy-in, in order to influence, and in order to make sure that I've kind of answered those questions. And not all senior leaders have made the connection with what, this is our daily work. We are living and breathing it on a daily basis. If you can make strong, compelling connections, you can provide evidence and you can connect the dots, then that's the best way to overcome skepticism. So this is what I do all day, every day. and in just about every client system, even the ones that are pioneers in this space and have been known to influence, because the conversation is evolving. And what I also understand is evolving at pace, the language is changing, the reframing. And if you're not agile and you're not flexible, you'll get caught out, simply. So what I'm always doing is being adaptable and being sensitive to that very methodology that I employ. So the example that comes to mind is a CEO of an international business who I went to see. And as soon as I walked in the door, he said, don't talk to me about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, I have 70 nationalities in my business. This is not a topic I want to talk about. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Okay, let's not talk about DE&I then. Let's not talk about it. Tell me, what's your mission for the business? Tell me, what are your growth plans? What is your vision for your business? Going back to my earlier point, what are your challenges today, and what are your plans in place to overcome some of those? And he responded really enthusiastically to that question. He was like, growth, new products, new services, new markets, digitization, new ways of doing things, Africa, Asia, and he was just going on, and it was so exciting. His body language, his whole demeanor just changed from that earlier, D&I or die type moment. I think that's what I'll call it. And I listened very intently. And then my next question to him was, that's brilliant. That's a fantastic vision. Who's going to help you deliver it? And he said, my leaders. I said, right, I can understand that. Tell me about your leaders. What do they look like? And he paused and he said, oh, that's a strange question. I said, no, just tell me, what do they look like? And he said, well, my leadership team is all male, it's all white, all over 55, and all British. So we paused, and then I said, right, okay. Has this leadership team delivered for you? Is this leadership team helped you to get to where you are today? He said, without a doubt. Have they, brought their skills, abilities to the table and help you grow and become a successful? And he said, without a doubt. Have they sacrificed aspects of themselves? He said, without a doubt. I said, so what are you doing for them? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, in order to prepare for this next stage of the journey, what are you doing to give them the competence and the mindset to manage those different markets, to deal with customers that might have different preferences, to look at the talent of the future, to manage the digital opportunity? What are you doing for them? And he said, nothing. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting. You're expecting them to deliver for you and you're not asking them. He said, oh, Farrah, they'll work it out themselves. They always do. And I said, well, that might be part of the problem. And by the time your opportunity, you've given your opportunity vis-a-vis what you might need to do, that might be part of the problem. And he paused and he was reflecting and he said, oh, I think you might have a point there. And I said, by the way, tell me too, you told me you have 70 nationalities. How come for 5 layers down from senior leadership, everybody looks like you? Everybody sounds like you. Everybody kind of like behaves like you as well. Tell me, why is that the case when you have so much diversity in the business? And then we had a completely different conversation. That leader took that challenge, took the influence and that moment to completely redefine his business. He was brave. He looked in his blind spots and they were there with guidance and with support. And once he uncovered those blind spots, he loved his business, by the way. He was astonished. He couldn't believe that there was an underbelly in the organization. And when he heard those voices that he'd never heard before, he completely refashioned his business. He went on to be very successful. Not only did he influence his own business, he influenced the whole sector. So I live in hope. D&I is not dead. D&I is alive and well. It might be different language. It might have different nuances. It might be that we need to adapt more and connect with a future that is more uncertain and more volatile than we've ever known. It might be that we need to look at our language and the local context more. It might be that we need to make stronger connections, but D&I is not dead.
Thank you very much for that. That was a fantastic example. So I think what I'm hearing here is don't be afraid of the opposition. Listen to those voices. Listen to what the opposers are saying. Yeah, include them in the conversation. Take their issues on board. Take their concerns on board. Find ways to respond to them. Find ways to respond to them that shows them, that educates them, that opens their minds to how D&I is still relevant. Because the data shows it, doesn't it? I mean, I think there was recently a report from McKinsey that, once again showed all of the business benefits, the growth, the employee retention, the profitability of businesses that have diverse, equitable, and inclusive cultures. So the evidence is all there. So it's all about engaging with your detractor. It's that ultimate act of inclusion, isn't it? Include your opponent in the conversation. Include the person that says DEI must die. Include them in the conversation. Make them feel relevant. Make them feel important. Make them feel listened to. Make them part of the DEI conversation again, and then move forward and make it stronger. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, because those very detractors may become your biggest supporters, because often the basis of the detraction might be misinformation. It might be the zero-sum game mentality. It might be that they haven't, the blind spots haven't been checked. And it may be, and I'm not naive, right? I also know that for some people, they are very conscious about their bias. They actively, have certain mindsets. So there is that other angle to it as well. But more often than not, through dialogue, through discussion, people's true value sets and their thoughts and opinions emerge. And when it comes to discrimination and stereotyping, they're often baseless, absolutely baseless. But without having that dialogue, without creating that space, we're never going to know. And what's more dangerous is that it's hidden, it's insidious, that prejudice coupled with power, not being expressed in openly and having an opportunity to have a dialogue, shows itself in different ways. It shows itself in decisions which exclude. It shows itself in decisions which don't give opportunities. It shows itself in more subtle, insidious, and deeply dangerous ways. And so, you know what? I'd be happier to have a conversation and at least have an opportunity. Our model in global diversity practice has always been threefold. Tackle the head. So demystify compelling conversations, make it relevant to the industry, to the sector, to that leader, find out what keeps them awake at night, connect the dots between how inclusion can bring back their sleep, figuratively speaking, understand what their competitors are doing, understand what's the evolution in their industry, understand how inclusion can propel them forward, and make sure you make that case. Demystify these concepts so that they're not looking at them from a stereotypical lens or a lens which promotes fear or ignorance. So build their confidence and competence in this area. Why do we assume that leaders already have inclusion competence? They may be fantastic leaders who are technically very strong. They may have built brilliant businesses, and many of them are. But why do we assume that inclusion was always part of their toolkit? So let's get that work done. Secondly, create empathy and understanding. Some people have lived experience, and that provides a certain perspective. It also provides a certain passion. But for others, create allyship by promoting empathy. Help them to understand. I think one of the most compelling conversations today, interestingly, going back to Elon Musk, is about the conversation around privilege. And how can you redistribute your privilege to become an ally? So that's the heart piece, and understand the experience of exclusion and how it gets in the way of every value you've ever created and spent millions developing, how it gets in the way of every conversation you've had about valuing people and the market and whatever. And the third aspect is hands, the practical tools. When we work with leaders, they go away with very clear actions. And intention is a beautiful thing, but it doesn't deliver results. So not only actions, but accountability. So provide the tools, provide the incentive, and then keep the conversation going. Celebrate successes because there's loads, but don't be afraid to tackle the continuing challenges, because D&I is not done, one and done. It's an evolutionary process. And once you begin to resolve some of the surface level issues, you start going beneath the waterline, and that's where the real work needs to be done. That's the culture of the organisation. And if we don't pay attention to the critical mass, which is beneath the waterline, we'll never achieve our objectives in D&I. So I'm very positive about what's happening right now. And I'm very hopeful that this gives us a chance to just refresh and recalibrate and move ahead.
Farrah Qureshi, founder and CEO of Global Diversity Practice, thank you so much for a fantastic discussion today.